Welcome to this video on literature reviews, critically analysing research and drawing conclusions. My name is Cecile Badenhorst and I'm in the adult and post-secondary programs in the Faculty of Education at Memorial University. I just want to make a quick note that I have lots of videos on topics related to thesis and master's thesis and doctoral writing and research writing in general, so please go and have a look at those. The purpose of this video is to take you through some quick tips and techniques on how to read source texts critically, to show you how to draw conclusions from reading those source texts, and to provide you with examples of how these things are written into a literature review paper. And I'm going to use a published paper as an example. So this is the paper that I'm going to use as an example, and I'll have the full reference at the end as well. What I probably should say is the paper is about physical education and academic achievement, and it was a literature review, and the authors focused on published research within a particular period. Okay, so let's quickly go through how to read critically. Critical reading is about deconstructing a source text. It's about examining the logic of it. It's about critiquing fairly. And what I mean by fairly is, if you're looking at a qualitative study, you can't come at it with a quantitative lens and say, well, this is a terrible study because this research isn't generalizable, because a qualitative study was not intended to do that. So you need to criticize it within the internal consistency of that particular paper. And a thing to think about when you are critiquing is that we are always positioned by our backgrounds and our beliefs, and those beliefs can skew our judgment. And as scholars, we want to try and be as fair as possible, realizing that we are coming from this position. I want to take you through a process for critically reading a source text, which comes from Hart 2018. So the argument here, or the suggestion here, is that you read the abstract, because the abstract should be a summary of the entire paper. So you should get a sense from the abstract about the research problem and the author's purpose. So as you read the abstract, note for yourself, this is the author's purpose, this is the research problem. Then you scan through the text and see if you can build on those points. Is there something more to this? Does the abstract reflect the paper? Because sometimes it doesn't. So you can't rely on the abstract alone. But you're scanning through, you're looking at the headings, you might read the conclusion much more fully, but you're getting a sense of the paper. Then you might read the text again and you're highlighting words like yet, thus, therefore, however, which indicates a shift, and they're usually linked to an argument. Now, of course, this won't be the case in every paper you read. It's just a technique and a tip to help you try to find the author's argument. What you want to try and do is summarize the argument, and if the argument is still unclear, then just note points the author's saying and try and explain why the author is saying that. Highlight any conclusions plus the reasons for the conclusions. Generally, conclusions follow the words therefore, thus, consequently, as a result of. And you want to look for these conclusions that are drawn throughout the paper as well as the main ones at the end of the paper. Then, once you've identified the conclusions, then take each conclusion and evaluate the reasons for those conclusions. Typical words for reasons would include because, since, it follows, and so on. And then really you're asking yourself, am I convinced by the conclusions and by the evidence being given? You want to question both the claims and the conclusions of an argument. So not only what the author is arguing, but ultimately the conclusions they come to. And the reason why we question the claims is because we always start an argument with assumptions. because we need to create a beginning point, and that means that we assume some things. So this is where you can provide critical insight. Is this the place to begin the argument? Is it a worthwhile argument overall? Is the focus appropriate? Are there other questions we should be asking, or other arguments we should be making? That's where you can bring your critical eye in. And then the conclusions need to logically and reasonably follow from the claims being made and be supported by evidence. Sometimes, and I'm guilty of this myself, I'm guilty of making these leaps in reasoning and having more argument than evidence. And remember that critiquing a paper can include a positive appraisal. You don't always have to be negative when you're critiquing a paper. So you can critique a study and decide that the research was well done and significant. But generally you would try to include, both positives and some negatives. And the negatives don't have to be outright rejections of the paper. They can just be slight modifications of the arguments or the conclusions drawn. And although I'm talking about a quick guide, and I know everyone's going to jump onto this and say, oh, well, we just need to scan the text, this is not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that you scan the text as a way into the article, as a way of reading with purpose, so that you have an idea of what you're looking for and you're making notes while you do it. But you may have to read the source text several times in order to get the critique done, in order to understand what's going on and then to complete this critique. Now, I do have a number of videos on reading and making notes from your reading and how to incorporate those into a literature review. So please go and have a look at those videos. The goal of a literature review is to bring together different studies, to find new meaning from the sum of the parts, now viewed as a whole, than can be obtained by reading each one individually. So the point of a literature review for a reader, and I guess for yourself as well, is to pull together meaning from all these different texts and to make sense of it. So really what we're trying to do is to develop conclusions. And we're developing those conclusions at a number of different levels. So we're developing conclusions on the source texts, and we do that through our note-taking. We're developing conclusions across source texts, and that's where we bring in analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And then we draw these meta-conclusions, where it's like a step back kind of synthesis, when we make points on what we can say now that we've done this review. And people always say to me, well, I don't have anything to say. And I would say to you, just draw 3 meta conclusions. And if you give yourself a challenge like that, what 3 things can I say about this? You'll find that you can come up with 3 things. And they usually are quite significant because it's based on your analysis. So it's almost it's pushing yourself just that little bit further, dig a little bit further, ask yourself what this all means. So in order to draw these conclusions, we need to go through a process of analysis and synthesis in a literature review. Analysis is taking apart a research article, or taking apart a topic or an issue, or taking apart a particular argument to see how it was constructed. So any kind of issue, argument, methodology, those are things that we take apart to analyze further. Synthesis is reassembling the pieces of whatever it is you're looking at the ideas, the arguments, the topic, the issue, and you're pulling all of those individual analyses that you've made. You're pulling that together now, and you're coming up with new conclusions. So I just wanted to show you what they did in this paper, the Zach et al. 2017 paper. So this was in the results section of their paper. but they do this all the way through. It's written in the introduction, it's all the way through. So what they did was they found 25 articles that dealt with the link between physical education and academic achievement. Then they read each of those articles. They did individual critiques of each of those articles. Once they'd done that, they were able to divide them into 3 groups. That's analysis. So just dividing those 25 articles into 3 groups is analysis, because you're making decisions and judgments on those articles. And then once they had grouped them into the 3 groups, they then looked at them as a whole and analyzed those groups and came up with conclusions. So that's an example of analysis in a literature review. Synthesis is where you reassemble with insight. And just to give you an example of synthesis statements, and this comes from the discussion section of their paper. So I'm beginning with there is a general agreement here. There is a general agreement amongst researchers that physical education classes do not detract from the academic achievements of the children, even in the institutions, whatever. So that statement is a synthesis statement. You can't make a statement like that unless you've read that literature and you've drawn that conclusion. So that's a synthesis statement, that in all the papers that we've read, there is this general agreement. Okay. It's an example of a synthesis statement. So when you're reading your individual texts, these are some analysis questions that you can ask, and you can develop other analysis questions as well. I'm just trying to give you some examples. In what ways have researchers addressed the concept or topic or issue? What conclusions have these researchers drawn about the concept, topic, or issue? What do we know and not know about the concept, topic, or issue that these authors are now contributing to? And then just one more point about analysis. What you're doing with analysis, I feel like I need to explain this a bit more, is that you're analyzing individual papers, but then you're also analyzing across the papers that you're reviewing. So grouping them is a good way to analyze. So you might ask these questions of the individual papers, and then you might ask these questions of the group papers or other questions. I hope that's clear. And then synthesis questions, what kind of agreement or disagreement is there in the research literature? Are there issues that are contentious, that are controversial? Are there issues or concepts not considered in the research literature? So finding absences can also help you make a critical comment. So synthesis questions are looking across the source texts and asking, what commonalities, what differences, those kinds of things. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples, but really what I'm showing you is how these things are written into a literature review. So, I want to show you the types of sentences, the types of paragraphs using the example paper. So to begin with, an example paragraph of how a source text is summarized, but then also synthesized. There's a connection there as well. So if you have a look at this paragraph in another study, so you know that the authors have done this several times. They're trying to explain the research on a particular issue. So in another study, Reed et al. Aimed at examining the impact of physical education integration in academic curricula on school children's fluid intelligence and academic achievements. They go on, if you have a look, they go on to describe what the study was about. Teachers who participated in the experiment inserted physical activities into the research group's classes, which included a total of 80 children. So they're giving you the details of the research project just in a paragraph. They required the children to walk approximately 1,200 steps for 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week, 4 months. Now, in the original paper, that would have been written up in a page describing the methodology, but these authors have now summarized it very quickly, given us only the pertinent information. We can see that it's an experimental study. There was a control group. And then, so they've described the methodology, and then they say the researchers come to the conclusion that movement can have an impact on fluid intelligence, and that this kind of activity seems to influence the cognitive development of elementary school children. In their review regarding the impact, so Reed was the study. Now they're making these links to other studies. Tomporowski et al. Reported similar findings. So it's just making that connection that although Reed and colleagues found this in their study, other people have found this as well. So I like the way it was written because it gives you a really clear indication of how to describe a study in a review, but make a connection in a very simple way. It's something that you can model in your own literature reviews. So I want to look at comparing and contrasting now. And this is what they said in the paper. There are two basic premises that characterize the studies that were grouped in this category. So now they're looking at one of their three categories, and they can come up with these two differences in approaching their particular topic. The first premise claims, okay, and then they go on, the proponents of this assumption base their claims on, these studies examine the link between, okay, the second premise claims, and then they go on to explain that. So they identify the two differences, they describe the one, they describe the other, and in doing that they are comparing and contrasting the two. They're showing the difference between the two. Now you can't do this unless you've got to that point of synthesis, where through your initial analysis of individual source texts, you were able to group like-minded studies. You can only make these comments after you've done that kind of analysis. But what I wanted to show you was how it is written up. There is an introductory sentence which tells the reader very clearly, within this group, there are two different points of view. The first point of view, and then they describe it. The second point of view, and they describe it, and they show the differences between them. Describing a concept and explaining strengths and limitations. So describing a concept can be quite complex. It's not as simple as a dictionary definition in the kind of work that we do, and particularly in literature reviews. So you want to show the range of definitions or the range of understandings about this concept, and then eventually come to what you think is the most useful concept. So here they're trying to explain, they're unpacking the concept. They're saying our aim is to examine the existing link between physical education and academic achievement. Physical education is the general term. Okay, so this is our common understanding of it. But their definition down here of PE differentiates from the present study. This definition of PE differentiates the present study from previous research. So what they're trying to say to you is that while there are these definitions, we're doing something different, or while they did something different, we're going to do, follow this conventional way of looking. So I hope I'm getting across what I hope you're understanding what I'm trying to say is that they are very clearly telling you which definition they're using and how it differentiates from other definitions. Again, you can only make these statements once you've done the analysis, and because these are synthesis statements. So you can only do them once you've done the individual reading of source texts, group the source texts in particular ways, and then now you can comment on it. Okay, more about synthesis of sources, and this is showing you how you can read across the sources. So here they're talking about one of their categories, which they've called the interventionist category. And even though they've grouped the papers in this interventionist category, they're saying that not all of these findings say exactly the same thing. Rather, intervention programs differ in many aspects. So they've grouped all these papers because they are research studies on intervention programs, but all the studies have slight differences, sometimes maybe major differences. Um, so it's so it's talking about those differences even within that grouping. So they differ in many aspects, their content, intensity, duration, frequency. So here they're giving you details about the differences. These intervention programs have no common denominator that enables us to reach any firm conclusions. What I want to point out here is that they are being quite certain and they're drawing a conclusion about something that is uncertain where they have no firm conclusions. So you can say things, you can make these synthesis statements, even if there is uncertainty in the literature. And they're saying it quite clearly. They're saying, we did this analysis of all these individual papers. They are grouped in this particular category because we decided on this grouping. It served our purposes. But within that grouping, the papers vary quite substantially. And we can come to the conclusion that there's no commonality among these particular studies. And these are conclusions that they are drawing about the literature. That's a critical element. These are critical comments that they're making. So they don't have to critique each individual paper to make these critical comments in reviewing the literature as a whole. Okay, showing connections between different source texts. Again, just a couple of sentences to show you how they do this. And I'm looking here. One such variable might be children's socioeconomic status, which is a strong predictor of academic achievement and of participation in physical activity. And therefore, it's not surprising that the results of the reviewed studies are not uniform. So here what they're doing is they're linking one sentence from a particular source and then expanding that to a number of sources. So they're showing connections between one source and a synthesis of other sources. And again, they're drawing a conclusion, which is a critical conclusion. It's not surprising that the results of the reviewed studies are not uniform. One of the things that I find students often do in literature reviews is that they're trying to find consensus, everyone who agrees on a particular topic. And it's often in academic work you won't find consensus. You'll find general agreement, but with it might be partial agreements with differences. And they are highlighting this as an issue here, and they're drawing a conclusion. It's not surprising the results of the reviewed studies are not uniform. Again, you can't make this kind of statement unless you've done the analysis. And then to look at the second example, they come to the end of a section where they're talking about another study. These results are in line with Jensen's claims about the importance of recess in learning. So just to show you that you can make these connections between studies, individual studies, they don't always have to be the synthesis statement. So you could make a point about one study and then link it to another study. And by doing both of those, you are creating synthesis statements. So examples of noting weaknesses or limitations in source texts. I know that many people find this difficult because you don't feel confident enough to critique a source text. What I want to show you is that you don't necessarily have to critique the text in this highly critical way. You're just making commentaries on the text, and sometimes you can make commentaries on these texts based on your experience of the field and being a practitioner in the field. For example, if I've taught PE classes, I might have a good understanding of these issues, and then can bring that practice into the critique. But what you can see they've done here is they're making synthesis critique sentences here. Although the body of research concerning the integrative relationship is still limited in scope, the direct and immediate associations are promising about such relationships and warrant further research. So the integrative relationship was one of their other categories. So, and what they're saying is that not a lot has been written about this, so it's limited in scope. You know, there might not be variations on these studies, but it looks promising. That's a critical comment. And it looks promising in these directions, such as relationships. Okay. The next one, the main difficulty with these studies is that there are no data on the content taught in PE classes on the way it was taught. So there they're not criticizing individual studies for the way the study was done, but they're saying that the focus for most of these studies doesn't give us enough information because they're looking at other things. So they're drawing a synthesis, or they're making a synthesis statement on the limitation. So the main difficulty with these studies, they're not saying these studies are inaccurate or they're wrong. It's just a difficulty with these studies. And the reason behind these findings remain largely unknown. So, the studies have come up with the findings, but we still don't know why this is happening. And then they expand on this to explain to the reader why they think this is an important comment to make. And then here's another statement on a limitation. The current research has not been able to comprehensively pinpoint what variations in physical education may affect academic achievement. And you can see that they've taken this from another source. So it's not their own conclusion, but in their analysis and synthesis, they have pulled this out as an important conclusion. And again, they're saying, from our analysis, we can see this, but look, someone else has said this as well. And just look at the wording. They're not saying current research is wrong or is terrible or has been done badly. They're saying has not been able to comprehensively pinpoint. So there's caution in the language, that the language is quite soft around the critique. Okay. Writing up conclusions and creating new meaning, because again, with a literature review, this is what we're aiming for. We're aiming to come up with conclusions that will be interesting and new for our readers. And it's new because it's our analysis of the literature. So I want you to think about conclusions on a number of different levels, and I've shown you examples throughout this presentation on conclusions within the paper as well as conclusions at the end of the paper. So the way this literature review was structured in the example I'm using, they divided the literature into the 3 groups. They explained why they did that, and then they had a section on each of those 3 groups where they explained the literature and then critically analyzed the literature. And at the end of each section, they came to some conclusion. So although the body of research concerning the integrative relationship is still limited in scope, the direct and immediate associations are promising. So at the end of each section, they told you what they thought about not only those studies, but their process of analysis. So they went through their analysis and then came to synthesis statements and conclusions. Of course, you also want to have a conclusion at the end of your paper, because this is really where you make sense of the source text for your reader and the whole process you've been through. So you want to have a fairly substantial conclusion. You don't want to just have a paragraph at the end and say, well, I hope my reader can understand what I tried to do here. You need to actually explain to your reader what you did and then draw those conclusions. So they begin this example here by reviewing what they did. Our classification of the reviewed studies into 3 categories, and those were their 3 categories, enables us to reach a number of conclusions. So they didn't categorize these studies randomly. They did it with purpose because they wanted to come to these conclusions. So they tell you, summarize again what they did. They go through each of the three categories. They explain what happened there. So they're reminding you, but it's not just a review. It's really consolidating in the reader's mind what they did and why they did it for a particular purpose. And then they come to their results. Our results are in line with the conclusion presented by others. So again, they're reinforcing what they've said by referring to the literature. We think this, but others think so too. And there they are really stacking the evidence. So they want to show you that this is really important and it is supported in the literature. And then they go on to present their findings and conclusions. And again, bringing in the literature each time. So I've got three sets of conclusions here that I'm talking about. The first set is conclusions to sections, where you're making these smaller conclusions on that section for the reader. The second lot of conclusions are the conclusions to your findings. So after your analysis, you will come to some conclusions. That's the second set of conclusions. And that's really the meat of the paper, the literature review. But then at the end, you want to draw these meta conclusions, which is taking a step back and saying, what does this all mean? And to help you understand this, what I'm talking about is the kind of shape of a literature review. It usually goes from a broad topic to your narrow focus, which is the problem that you're researching. Then you have the body where you do this critical analysis of the literature and synthesize. And then you draw conclusions. So at the top of the pyramid here are your close findings from your analysis and synthesis. But then you need to broaden it out again to go back to that broad topic that you introduced at the beginning. And this is where you make meta conclusions. And the meta conclusions are in relation to that broader topic. So you take a step back from your close findings and you're saying, what do these close findings mean? And what are the implications of these close findings? So an example of meta conclusions in the paper that I'm showing you, the findings of the current review encourage expansion of the reviewed studies in two main directions. First, future studies should be extended to other subjects and populations. Second, research should also be focused on the way learning is acquired. So in this example, they're focusing on future research, but you could draw meta conclusions on practice, on theory, on concepts, on anything that is relevant to your topic or your field. Okay, so just to very quickly go over some of the key points of this video, what I've tried to show you are some quick strategies for reading and reading to analyze and synthesize. And then what I tried to show you was how these analysis statements and synthesis statements are written in a literature review. And then finally, how to draw strong conclusions. And that your strong conclusions can be written in cautious language, but they can still be firm, strong conclusions. I know it's complex, and perhaps this gives you some idea of why the literature review is a difficult chapter to write or a paper to write. But, there are ways through it, and, the analysis is fun. It's interesting to read the research papers. It's interesting to draw the conclusions. And your reader really wants to hear what you think of the literature at the end of the day. So that's what you want to convey and communicate. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you don't have to go and lie down on a bed now, because it's so overwhelming. And yeah, I hope you can use something from here in your literature reviews.